Welcome back, everyone. My name is Ashley Smart. I am the Associate Director of the Night Science Journalism Program. And we have a fantastic panel for this morning. Before we get to that, I want to make a quick announcement and just remind you that on the back of your programs, there is a QR code that you can scan to take you to the official event webpage, which will have the full program with speaker details and session details and other information. So I just want to make sure everyone's aware of that. And it is my pleasure to introduce the first panel of the day. So 15 years ago, the Night Science Journalism Program hosted a series of talks entitled The Future of Science Journalism in honor of its 25th anniversary. In an opening speech, then Director Boyce Rinsberger described what he saw as a critical juncture for the field, saying, quote, "With respect to the ghost of Stephen Jay Gould, there's been a punctuation in what we thought was a relatively comfortable equilibrium," unquote. I think it's fair to say 15 years later that we're at another punctuation mark. We're grappling with big, complex stories that will shape humanity's course for decades to come, stories about climate change, infectious disease, artificial intelligence. We're navigating changing publishing and financial models. We're learning to work with new tools and tell stories in new ways. We're increasingly speaking to more polarized audiences. And so it's fitting that we welcome back Mr. Rinsberger today to once again kick off a discussion about the future of science journalism. An award-winning journalist, Rinsberger was a science reporter for the Detroit Free Press and the New York Times, and science editor at the Washington Post before taking the helm of KSJ in 1998. He led the program for a decade, helping to expand its reach and build upon its considerable reputation. And today, Mr. Rinsberger is joined by an international panel of KSJ fellows, past and present, spanning more than 20 years of the program's existence. And together, they'll take stock of where the field of science journalism is today and where it may be headed in the years and decades to come. It is a privilege and an honor to introduce this morning's panel and to welcome its moderator, former KSJ Director Boyce Rinsberger.
Thank you, Ashley. I'm happy to be here, and I had we're going to do something a little, well, first I should say 40 years with this program. That's half a lifetime, or it's half my lifetime at any rate. It's amazing that it's survived. It's a great tribute to Victor and his wisdom and foresight in creating this program and twisting the arms of the Knight Foundation to pay for it. So, to Victor, I had prepared some notes for my piece of this conversation, and then on a whim, I thought, well, I've heard about this Chat GPT thing, and what it can write term papers, and I don't know, maybe even write. Maybe there's a Mary Roach in its brain somewhere. So I went on the thing, and I dumped my notes into. I said, write a speech based on this, and the notes had some sentences. I like to keep my notes sometimes written out as sentences, is the way I think of them, and others are just words. But so in about 30 seconds, it came back with what I'm going to read to you now. And it starts out, "Good afternoon." That was its worst mistake. And then it said "everyone." So I'm going to read this with the occasional diversion. It's amazing to me, and kind of scary, that it actually has some content that's worth thinking about. So here it says it. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be back at MIT to celebrate 4 decades of the Knight Fellowships. Today we're here to discuss the present and future of science journalism and the challenges we face in an era of rapidly changing media landscapes. 15 years ago, at the 25th Anniversary Symposium, we had a panel on the present and future of science journalism, and one of the main speakers was Tom Rosenstiel. And GPT dropped out a little reference as to who he is. Tom Rosenstiel is the co-author of an excellent book called The Elements of Journalism. And if you haven't seen it or don't know about it, you get a copy and read it. Okay, Tom Rosenstiel, who pointed out that we traditional journalists are still functioning as gatekeepers, letting only the most reliable information through to our readers and viewers and listeners. But on either side of our gate, the fence is falling down. Well, now it's 15 years later. I'm still going, this is still GPT. Now, 15 years later, we're still at the gates, but there are no fences at all. And that's because of something called PR 2.0, which means that universities, corporations, and research centers are no longer focusing their PR efforts on putting information into the hands of journalists. They're going directly to the public through their own websites, podcasts, social media feeds, and so on. Did it say and so on? No, I added that, sorry. So, going back to the dictates of this machine, this kind of, quote, science communication, and I had put quotes, I just did air quotes. I hate those things, but anyway, science communication often lacks background and perspective and does not include comments from disinterested experts. Even more troubling, PR 2.0 is putting out single source stories where the source is the outfit paying the salaries of the, quotes, science communicators, unquote. Those science writers who create content, that's in quotes too, don't have a conflict of interest. They have just one interest, and that's the university or corporation that pays their salaries. And by contrast, we traditional journalists work for the public. I had some nuance written into that there, but GPT thought that was superfluous. But you all know what that could have been. Our salaries or freelance fees come from an organization that exists to serve the public. Yeah, that's what we think. However, there are fewer of those news organizations today, as the number of newspapers in the US has dropped by about 25% in the last 15 years. Now, me again, it was dropping before that as well, but GPT took that 15-year figure. Okay, back to the oracle. We are still at the gates, and we hope the public is media savvy enough to find us. Most traditional media have tried to compete by creating websites and developing multimedia presentations, but the data analytics show that the average length of time people spend on a given site is falling. And skipping away from the dictates here, or the dictation of this machine, it dropped out some data from the Pew Research people who showed that, I've forgotten the time, about 3 or 4 years ago, the average length of time that people spent on following a given click on a site was 1.5 minutes, 1 minute and 30 seconds. That has dropped now to a minute or less. Okay, back to chat. It's a jungle out there. I might have had that in my notes, I'm not sure, but at least in the American landscape, we're going to hear about other parts of the world. Turns out there is a bigger world out there. However, we have an excellent panel here today to give us a broader perspective on how responsible journalism is doing and can change in the near future. So let's use this opportunity to discuss how we can continue to uphold the values of reliable and informative science journalism, even in the face of PR 2.0 and other challenges. Thank you for your attention, and let's get started. That's applause for ChatGPT, I know, not me. What it omitted and dropped out was a lot of stuff I had in my notes about the huge growth of web-based content. And you're all familiar with this, and many, many different kinds of websites and stuff you can get on the internet, put it that way, that's produced by people, by the interested parties. Oh, there's people over here too. That's produced by the interested parties. The sources are now in control of the message and the media, mediums, media. There used to be a lab here that dealt with the media lab. Is there still? Just one of those is a site called ScienceDaily.com. Are you familiar with it? It's got a lot of cool stuff on it, but everything on it is reprints of press releases that come from the institutions that are doing the research. So it's them blowing their own horns. There's a lot of cool stuff there, and you can get ideas for stories that you could do through journalism. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to introduce our panel very briefly, and they'll speak in the order in which they are seated, actually. We have Ehsan Massoud, who's and by the way, all are Knight Fellows, current or former. Ehsan is Bureau Chief at Nature for the Middle East and Africa. He's a science and policy writer and broadcaster, and he used to teach international science and innovation policy at Imperial College London. Our second speaker will be Akin Jimo, who is the chief editor of Nature Africa, and that's a publication that's part of the Nature, the big Nature magazine's portfolio empire. I'm not sure how to describe it. But he was, back when I knew him, when he was a Knight Fellow, he was on the science desk at The Guardian, which was the leading serious newspaper in Nigeria. He went on to get a master's in health promotion and education, and he is now the mentor and Anglophone coordinator of the Science Journalism Cooperation Project of the World Federation of Science Journalists. Okay, number 3 will be Tiago Medaglia, who's a science and environmental journalist from Brazil, and the founder of Ambiental Media. And I believe he's going to show us some cool stuff that is on that website, where, and this is a quote from him, "We transform science into compelling and accessible media products," unquote. I'm a little curious about that term, products, but anyway, sounds commercial. Is a former editor of the National Geographic Brazil magazine. After him will be Mary Rose Abraham, who's a current fellow. She's a multimedia journalist with experience in audio, video production, reporter, writer, anchor. Her work has been featured on ABC News, Atlas Obscura, which is a fun website you should visit, BBC News, Deutsche Welle, The Guardian, Marketplace, National Geographic, NPR, and on and on. I didn't have room for more of her venues. And at the end, we'll come back to the United States with Pam Bellick, who's a health and science reporter at the New York Times, and who has many honors in her resume, including a Pulitzer Prize. You've probably heard of that? Okay. And more important than that, she won the Victor Cohn Prize for Excellence in Medical Science Reporting. Vic and I used to work together at the Post. And lots of awards from other people. So each speaker will have 10 minutes to talk, and we have a serious timekeeper sitting here in front who will cut our mics at that point, or cut this mic, or push us off the stage. I'm not sure what. I'm not sure how tough she is, but we'll see. And we'll plan to end with 20 minutes to 30 minutes for questions and discussion. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, first actual Knight Fellow. I've never been a Knight Fellow, so I can't claim that honor, but Esun Masood.
Hi everybody. This is so unnerving. It's like the final project presentation from hell, not just before 10 people, but I don't know, like 2,000 of you here. I'm from the class of 2017-18, which makes me 5 in KSJ years. And I'd like to recognize 3 of my awesome fellow toddlers who are here. Teresa Carr, Katie Enders, and Sujata Gupta. It's great to see so many of you, so many great friends and colleagues. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Boyce. Thank you, Deborah, of course, for all the great opportunities. And I'd also like to remember the late, great David Corcoran of the New York Times, here at the Night program. And he was my project advisor for an audio documentary that I did that came out of the fellowship. I did for the BBC on the last surviving scientist who'd been on the blacklist. And so that was very much, David was a part of that. Boyce has asked us to talk about the future, the present and the future of science journalism. I will turn my gaze a little bit to that question in the context of the shifting sands of geopolitics. At Nature, I have 2 roles now. I'm the responsible editor for our editorials. We are unusual in that we publish science journalism alongside primary research, and I'm very lucky that I work across those 2 teams. But my background is very much in reporting from the countries of the global south, environment, development, economics, and I've tried to keep my hand in as much as I can, and I do some commissioning, not as much as I'd like, but I still do that. And that's really the sort of the context for these next few minutes of remarks. One of the kind of absolute essentials for anyone who does my job is to read something called, and I know this is going to send you to sleep, the UNESCO World of Science Report. It's a snapshot of the state of global science. It comes out roughly every 5 years. And I've been reading it since the mid-1990s, and that's a really sort of odd admission to make, because it obviously makes me sound like a train spotter or somebody who collects bus numbers for a living, and I suppose that's probably what I am. This report does keep getting bigger, and it was 1 volume, it's now 4. And one thing that we all do when it comes out is to go to the data tables, particularly the data on science spending, because that's often a good indicator of change, of what's the trend. And it's particularly important for the countries that I report on, because often small changes can make quite a big difference. And you get a sort of quite a good sense of the state of some of the great historical geo-rivalries in science. Where is Bangladesh compared to Pakistan? Sorry, thank you. I am very nervous. Where is Nigeria compared with South Africa? Where is Iran with Saudi Arabia? And where is Argentina and Brazil? But there's one thing up until now that has not changed, and that, of course, the US is always at the top, and you sort of just kind of skim through those pages because there's nothing new really to say. US spending on science and technology is always more than every other country. It's also more than if you add up all the original 28 EU members. And I say 28 because that includes the UK, and we can also always dream that one day we might come back. But if you look at the 2021 edition, there's one country that's caught up pretty much, and that, of course, is China. And China's spending on science in absolute terms, not necessarily per capita, has been on an exponential rise. UNESCO, of course, didn't say this explicitly. They haven't said that China's at or near number 1, and it's partly for technical reasons. China and the US are in different country categories. China is still officially an upper middle income country. US is a high income country. But what the editors did, I mean, they're good, smart editors, working in these sort of constrained circumstances, is they plotted a curve. With sort of lots of tangled lines in different colors for different countries, and you can sort of see the 2 outliers in those curves, and the US and China are touching now, pretty much. And so what then happens, or what you sort of then start to think about is, well, what does this actually mean for science journalism? Because most of my working life has been, apart from the countries that I operate in, but all my colleagues, we are very, very focused on this part of the world, on Western Europe, some aspect of Eastern Europe, but we don't really look at China quite in the same way. We don't look at Southeast Asia generally. But we now have a very significant new country that we all need to be writing about. And when I say we, That also, of course, includes the science journalists in China. You know, there's a big we in that word as well. And we, of course, know that they have a very different system of governance than lots of other countries, and that presents challenges, both for those of our colleagues inside and those of us on the outside. And those of us, pretty much, I would say, most of us in this room, you know, we are very lucky that we live in countries which have some form of representative government. We know the rules, the conventions, we don't know them in detail, but they allow us to do the kinds of jobs that we all do. And on the whole, we can approach scientists without permission, particularly permission of ministries. The scientists are allowed to speak to us without getting authorization, and what we publish does not go through censor boards or other kinds of sort of less invasive filters. Now, that is not the case in China, and it's not the case in lots of other countries. It's much harder to do interviews without approval. It's harder, if not impossible, for scientists to speak without getting permission, and publishers simply cannot publish without some sort of approval. The most benign form of that would be a friendly chat from the man from the ministry. Now, if you're from a large international publisher, and I'm very lucky to be working for one of those, I think many of you do as well, we have workarounds. And we can get around that. But when you're a science journalist in those countries, you don't always have those workarounds, and it's much more difficult. So I'm going to give you two examples of what I mean, and hopefully it'd be great to sort of spark, you know, in the Q&A or a discussion about what we might be able to do, both to help each other, but also to help those of our colleagues who are in these environments. When I was back on the MIT campus here in 2017-18, I took a course at Harvard, and it was called Restless Empire, and it was on the ascent of China, and it was with Professor Arnie Westad. Now, Restless Empire was also the title of his book, so I got the book, and I didn't finish the course, but I did finish all my MIT courses. Deborah, where are you? Yes, there you go, for the record. And it gave me an idea, while I was still in the class, gave me an idea for a reporting project, because Professor Westad spent several classes talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, this sort of multi-trillion-dollar project that China is embarked on building infrastructure along the countries across the old Silk Route, east to west, including in Europe. Most of this is very big infrastructure, the kinds of things people don't have, roads, trains, airports, electricity, water. There's a lot of pretty problematic and complex financing from China, but it's transforming countries, and people are very, very grateful for that, you know, if they don't have those sorts of amenities. And so when I sat through Professor Westad's class, I sort of thought, when you've got that level of investment, there's almost always going to be science in there somewhere. I mean, it's obviously not going to be on the level of the sort of hundreds of billions of dollars, but it will be there. And often it's just about science diplomacy, because China and the government there, they know that there is backlash and there is a lot of controversy. And so they're doing the kinds of soft power things that the US is an absolute master at. So is Europe. You know, funding for the arts, funding for science, funding for 2 minutes left, thank you, and other things. And so, so we set about creating a little team of people, and we fanned out from Beijing and Shanghai across the sort of Belt and Road, sort of our old little mini-style sort of Silk Road journey. And we, you know, looked at universities and research centers and lots of other things, and I won't go into the details here. But what became really clear was that access became more and more difficult as time went on. And those of our colleagues who were from those countries found it really difficult to get access as time went on, and those of us who were from outside had a little bit more access, and we found our workarounds. But it became really obvious to me at that point that doing, you know, genuine science journalism in these countries is going to be difficult. It's pretty much the same for the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia is a big example now. They're going to be quadrupling what they spend on science in the next sort of decade. They want to get to a much higher level much quicker, and they are, I mean, dare I say it, a more authoritarian system than even China is. Because in China, at least, there's a good spread of people who've been out and come back in, and they have a lot of international contacts. That isn't really the case there. So we have challenges. And I think, you know, those of us here, we are very, very, very fortunate that those we elect, by and large, and I know there's going to be people who will disagree with me on this, but they accept the concept of autonomy in journalism. They accept autonomy in research and in science. They accept they can't micromanage what happens in a lab. They can't micromanage what happens in a newsroom. And they accept the independence of regulatory agencies as much as possible, and I know there are exceptions. So what I'm saying here is that there are lots of places where these rules don't apply, and there are science journalists out there trying to do a jobbing piece of work, and they are struggling. So I hope we can, as an international community of fellows, we can think about what we might be able to do, both for ourselves, between ourselves, and of course with them. Thank you so much.
Akin, Jamo?
Good morning, everyone. Let me tell you a secret that the flyer about the number of minutes that remains was actually a threat from Boyce about 2 days ago. And he told me that I know you talk too much because you tell African stories. So thank you, Boyce, the boss. 22 years ago, I was here. And I have a couple of my colleagues who are also here, about 4 of us. And Martha Henry, who was the coordinator then, thank you so much for those days. Those days, there was no Google map. We used to use the paper map and miss the road a lot of the time. And I used to say, look, just go without thinking. And getting here this morning, we came without thinking. When you talk about, my name is Akin Jimo. I work with Nature Africa. And Nature Africa focuses on research in sub-Saharan Africa in a way that we can put the work of scientists in Africa, on public limelight. There are also other regional publications. There is Nature India. There are a number of other publications in a way that Nature can really reach, a wider kind of laboratories, bringing what we call, or what I would call, bringing the gown to the marketplace. And you know that when COVID came, science was in the marketplace, where anything goes. Pseudoscience was part of the key thing. But one of the key things that we have is the fact that there are a number of efforts, in Africa at the present moment. There is Africasti, there is Science Africa from a colleague in Kenya. There are a number of other publications that look at, quite a number. SciDef is one of the platforms also that is available. Science Cafe being conducted in Kenya, in Zimbabwe, the practicality of science in itself. And one of the other things we have is the fact that there's been a lot of projects, development aid from USAID, from DFID, people being trained on health journalism, and so on and so forth, forming the basis or the context, that we need to bring in the context of science, the evidence, in a way that we can promote or ensure that people change behavior to address key issues that affect them. Then there are also a number of efforts, with COVID and so on and so forth. There are a number of efforts in a way that things are being addressed, to ensure that we have a semblance, of reporting in a way that people will understand. And in Africa, to a large extent, you realize that one of the key things we have is the issue of the challenge of politics. Is more of the lead story. Business is another lead story. And as far back as 1987, I think, in 1987, there was the dumping of toxic waste in Koko. Koko is a rural community in Nigeria. And at that time, only one newspaper, came out with that story, to address the challenges that we were facing. But shortly after that, there were key issues of, the Gulf War. I actually got to get into the Guardian newspaper based on the stories I did on chemical weapon and nuclear weapon and so on and so forth. And when you look at all those things, these are templates that were being set, in a way that in the future, we can address key issues in science which an average journalist doesn't really want to touch because they may not understand what is being said. Then HIV/AIDS cure, in the year, I think around the year 2000, there were a number of things in Zaire, in Kenya, in Nigeria, people coming up that says they had a cure for HIV and so on and so forth. And along the line, things were being addressed in a way that a few of us who were reporting science, had to take the editor, the sub-editor to a 2-day, 3-day training in a way that they can understand and have perspective. And after that, when a story comes in, it's like, science desk, your story. So instead of going straight through the normal process, it's taken to science desk, and then that is addressed. And sometime in 1993, the science desk at The Guardian, where I was working then, or the health desk. We had a health desk that has traditional medicine and all the other reporting that were being, pushed out. That at the end of the day, we put in a concept that, look, we can't just be reporting health. Let's expand to other areas. Let's look at environment. Let's look at other key things in agriculture that really affect, the generality of the populace, across our countries. The same thing was happening in Uganda. The same thing was happening in Kenya. And Science Africa, for example, is one of the key platforms that we do have now. Africasti, African Science, Technology, and Innovation is another platform whereby, a number of journalists were being trained. And there has been a lot of training, across, the platforms in a way that you are bringing fellow journalists, because there's a belief that one tree does not make a forest. We are all here now like the elite of journalism, because when you come to science reporting, it's different. You need to know what you are talking about. If you don't know what you are talking about, the scientist is there, just like what you said. I mean, if a scientist said that, look, what you wrote is rubbish, that's the end of the work. But you have scrutiny at any point in time to really look at the key things that we do. And like I was saying, so there are quite a number of things. Bekisa is a Center for Health Journalism in South Africa. I mean, South Africa has really gone, far. There is Association of Freelance Journalists. One of my colleagues that's at Nature Africa, a senior editor, Lynn Smith, she used to be the president of the Freelancers Association in South Africa. And there are quite a number of things, being done. SciDev also is a force to reckon with. Let me briefly talk about the World Federation of Science Journalists. In the year 2006, John Mark, who used to be the director of the program then, came to Nigeria. And he went to a number of other African countries. We need to start a project. He came at a point where there was no movement in the country because it was census, counting the number of, we had national census at that time. And at the end of the day, it was to spend 3 days. He met myself, Deron Ifade, who was also a Knight Fellow in 2002. And by the second day, he spent just one night. He said, look, guys, I got what I wanted. And he left. And at the end of the day, that project, trained journalists across Africa, both Anglophone and Francophone. I've mentioned quite a number of barriers that, do happen. And so Anglophone, Francophone, and the work I do now at Nature Africa, we publish in English, but also translate into French. So across the continent, we have writers, both Francophone, Anglophone, in a way that we can address key issues that really affect us, at any point in time. And also, the trend, I mean, in Africa, there is a very high level of optimism. Optimism in the sense that a few who are focused on this are pushing the button in a way that we can advance more. Also, there are graduates, from science field who are turning into journalism. There are also schools of journalism. I sat on an advisory board of one school recently where they were trying to introduce science journalism, in the courses they do within that school. Also, I think in Kenya, in Nigeria, and a number of other countries, that is really something that is going on very well. Well, mentoring is very essential. The key thing is, if we all can clone ourselves, whom are you mentoring? That is very important. Because in 40 years' time, what are we going to say? That is very important. Are you training? Are you mentoring? And look at areas where there are challenges. In Sudan, things are happening just before I left. And what happened to the laboratories? What happened to a number of things, within that space? And I think I'll stop here. I'm sure that you have a lot of questions and stuff like that, and we'll be able to address a number of your questions. And I wish you a nice stay in this very warm environment. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Tiago Medaglia.
Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here, and I want to start by that's not my first slide. Spoiler alert. All right. So I hate those presentations where you see that slides are coming, but the speaker starts to speak about something else, and that's what I'm doing. So. First, I want to thank you, Deborah and Ashley, for the opportunity and for supporting my work many times. Thank you very much. Also, I want to say hello to Tony. Where is Tony? And Bethany, my colleagues from the 2020 fellows. We are the proud COVID fellows. One day we were raising glasses at a bar where Tony said, I always laughed when I remember this. Tony said, cheers to Tiago, who is much smarter than he looks, because I got into Harvard, and that was really funny. I really appreciate it. He said that with a warm heart. Believe it, we are friends. And on the other day, we were deciding if we should pack and leave the country. That was a very intense experience, but also we were very close, and we became friends. Well, I mentioned Harvard because I did a master's degree there in history of science. And I think if you keep your eyes open, this presentation is an opportunity to see how impactful the program can be for science journalists abroad. Because I went into a field that is called agnotology, which is the study of knowledge and ignorance. You can see as a complementary field to epistemology. And one of the key questions, by the way, I have an accent, so if you don't understand something, ask me later, please. And one of the key questions to agnotology is, why don't we know what we don't know? And I think this is a fantastic question for us science journalists, because usually when you think about that, in the topics that you usually cover, you are going to find amazing stories. So with that in mind, we decided to pursue a question. And the question is, I'm going to introduce you to Aquazonia. The thing is, there is an excessive focus when talking about the Amazon rainforest. That excessive focus is present in the legislation as well, in the mainstream media coverage, or on the global celebrities tweeting, when Twitter used to be something real. And, so there is an excessive focus on deforestation and fire. But we are talking about the biggest hydrographic basin in the planet. And we don't talk about water. We don't cover water enough in the Amazon. And the question, why don't we know what we don't know about water, is an important question. At least it seems to me that whatever happens in regards to water in the Amazon, it's going to be decisive for the future of humanity. And one of the reasons is that we have consolidated systems to monitor deforestation and fire, right? And they are also very visual phenomena, and it's much more complex with water. So we, as a group of science journalists, we decided to deal with that problem. The first thing we did, we didn't wake up and say, let's create an index. That's not a random decision. We actually look at what science had been producing in regards to water. And we interviewed a few specialists, and then looking at the data, looking at the most important scientific research, we came up with the idea, so hey, let's build an index. Then we spoke with a few specialists to see if that was doable. And the one thing we decided from the beginning is we must communicate this to the public as a science journalism product. Sorry about using that word. And not as a scientific study, because that's not what we do. But we needed safeguards. So we also, from the first step, we established, let's work with a researcher. Let's invite a biologist, someone who is a specialist on that topic, someone who has been publishing relevant studies on reputable journals, and let's work with this person. So that's one of the things we did. The other is we created, tried to replicate some attempt of creating a peer review process where we invited other specialists, other scientists, and also science journalists that work with data to, before publishing, before delivering our project, we invited them to analyze the methodology and the initial results. We incorporated their feedbacks and criticism in order to make our work better. This is a proof of how beautiful maps can be, I think, because we can see how alive the planet is. And if you go to the Amazon, I've been there as a reporter, and I can tell you that if you think that a city is noisy, you should sleep in the rainforest one night, but in the deep rainforest, and you hear many, many sounds. It's really alive. And then you can see on the corner, those are more than 11,000 micro-basins in the Brazilian Amazon rainforest. And then in the corner, you can see that the researcher that worked with us, Cecilia, who is a brilliant person and a brilliant scientist, she based it on scientific literature. She created this gradient from very low human impact to an extreme human impact. This is not the index. Those are the factors of impact, which are human activities that are impacting lakes, rivers, streams, and flooded forests, the aquatic ecosystems in the Amazon rainforest. So you have hydroelectric plants, you have cattle, you have illegal mining, industrial mining, so forth. This is our index plotted into a map. And I think this is I'm very proud of that, because on and on, every year we see in Brazil a publication of the deforestation map, where you see where the deforestation is advancing, and you see where the rainforest is preserved. But we have never, at least I have never seen it before. At least this is to me, this is the first equivalent map of aquatic ecosystems in the Amazon. And you can see in the yellow areas where the situation is worse, and in the dark green area where the aquatic ecosystems are more in a better situation. Then if you go to our website, you can have like a cool 3D navigation and understand a little better what we mean by impact and where those things are, where you can actually see them. And one important thing, this is a platform for other journalists, because you can actually, like what the index does, it highlights stories that need to be covered. And that's the case for Manaus. There is a story there. We couldn't travel because this project happened during the pandemic, But we are doing that right now. Reporters are traveling right now to cover stories that the index is highlighting. And the result on the left is the most important, the most general one that shows that 20% of aquatic ecosystems in the Amazon, in the Brazilian Amazon rainforest are already highly impacted by human activity, which is a huge number, according to our index, of course. And but if you cross the index with other layers of data, for instance, indigenous territories, you got, or states, or municipalities, you get different results, like specific results that are also very important. And the one on the right corner shows that 14% of indigenous water on indigenous territories are already highly impacted. That's important because it shows that we have done something right here, because that result actually echoes scientific studies that show that indigenous lands are key to the preservation of nature in general. Then this is not a map that we published, but you can actually, like I said, it highlights stories that need to be covered. So if you look for very tiny red spots on the map, that's a study that we did before, internally before publishing. Those are like, this is the situation where the situation is worse. So TIs is indigenous territories in Portuguese, and we are showing that there's a story to be covered here, or there's a scientific research that should be done there, because something is happening with lakes, rivers, and stories there. I'm very proud of this one, because this is something that is a mission for us. This is a local TV journalistic program, and they open our map and show the map for almost 10 minutes and spoke, among them, and interview other scientists to understand what's going on in our region. And a lot of local news in the Amazon, where is a region that journalism needs to be improved, use the data, or use the index, or mention the index, or interview local specialists, and that made us really, really happy and glad, because we are bringing science, through science journalism, we are bringing science to places where it's very necessary. Aquazonia won a few awards. We are also very proud of that, best data visualization in Brazil and Latin America. And this is the team that's working in the project. Kudos to Cecilia and Laura, who is the author behind the maps, and to everyone else. And I hope this is useful for our discussion later. Thank you very much.
And now to our newest Knight Fellow, Mary Rose Abraham.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today. I want to thank Deborah and Ashley for this opportunity to be on the panel today. And yes, I'm a current fellow, and a shout out to our class. There's only 7 of us. We're small but mighty. So today I want to talk to you about Science Journalism India. Right before the fellowship, I was based there for 7.5 years as a freelancer, doing pretty much science journalism the whole time. I should be clear that I moved there from California, so any observations I make are from an American perspective. So this is quite a broad overview. So we can start out with some basic facts. It is the world's largest democracy. It's a top 5 economy. And I thought it was interesting, scientific publications-wise, it's number 3. And on that list, China is actually number 1, and the US comes in at number 2. Just a note about that population. So at some point this year, I think mid-year, the UN estimates that China, or rather India, will overtake China at 1.43 billion people. We don't have an exact date, and that's because of population, or rather population data issues, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So in terms of the media landscape, it's kind of staggering in terms of the numbers. Not surprising when you consider the population, but I think the real reason here is the sheer number of languages. The Constitution of India lists 22 different languages. And if you factor in dialects and other things, you're getting into the hundreds and even thousands of languages. One concerning thing about the media landscape is the concentration of ownership. So there are like sort of a narrowing and even smaller numbers of corporations and individuals who are owning these media outlets. And a lot of them have quite close ties to Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his political party, which is the BJP, which is a Hindu nationalist party. And they've been in power since 2014. So I want to go over some of the challenges that journalists face working in India. The first one is press freedom. As you can see, Reporters Without Borders has ranked India rather low, 150 out of 180. It fell several slots from the previous year. And while reporting, journalists have been arrested on charges such as defamation, sedition, contempt of court, and endangering national security, and oftentimes are jailed without any charges at all, and that could be for years. A journalist who's critical of the government, there's a particular slur for this. Actually, this can be applied to anybody who's critical of the government, anti-national. So you can face threats not only from the government, but the BJP and Prime Minister Modi has a large base of supporters who really activate on their behalf. A second challenge is disinformation and misinformation. As Mary Roach said in her talk today, the truth is slipping away. This is quite true in India. It's a huge and rapidly increasing problem. And you'll see something as sort of innocuous as yoga can cure cancer, which has no factual basis. But in some cases, these things are quite dangerous. It's resulted in violence. It's resulted in people getting killed. These things are mainly spread on social media, of course. A lot of them come through WhatsApp forwards. And from a journalism standpoint, it's absolutely a fact checker's nightmare. These things travel so quickly, and they're traveling in a multitude of languages, so it's really hard to stop this stuff. And another challenge is data availability. So this is a problem nearly every journalist faces in almost every story you're reporting on. Finding data or surveys or statistics while reporting is really difficult. The information may not be available at all, or if it is, it's buried and inaccessible as a spreadsheet, or it's just unreliable overall. I'll give you a few examples of this. When I first went to India, I reported on rabies. Rabies has the highest incidence in India. But just the basic fact of how many people die from this disease was impossible to find. So there was only a rough estimate, about 18,000 to 20,000 per year. There's a lot of underreporting that happens with that disease because a lot of that's happened in rural areas with no health infrastructure. The same situation with COVID deaths. The government finally announced that it was just 500,000 people who died from COVID. But there was a later report from the World Health Organization, and they estimated 4.7 million. So a massive disparity. But in this case, it was also a political motivation to report that much lower number. And then going back to the population, which we talked about in the first slide, we don't know when India will get to this large population mark because the government hasn't done a census in the country since 2011. They were supposed to do one in 2020, got delayed by the pandemic, and I think it's on track now for 2024. So any population statistics are coming from sort of sample surveys, which don't give us the full picture. So in terms of who is doing science journalism, you will see it happening, in mainstream outlets, usually with very large, prominent stories. An example of this is earlier this year, India decided to reintroduce the cheetah into the country. This is an animal that went extinct in the 1950s. So they brought in animals from Africa, and all this sort of reporting was about the simple fact that this happened. They were transported, they're here, here's where they're located, what they're doing, but there was no sort of in-depth coverage in terms of what about the ecology, what about the impacts of introducing this species. And that kind of reporting was really only found in sites like you see here, in independent media sites, and a lot of that coverage is done by freelancers. I also wanted to highlight a couple of the organizations for science journalists. That top one there, Science Journalists of India, is fairly new. The Science Writers Association has been around for a while. And the Science Journalism Workshop is an excellent thing that happens every year in Bangalore. It's actually started by a former KSJ fellow, Anil Ananthaswamy. I don't know if he's here today, but shout out to him. And then to wrap this up, I want to just highlight 3 stories that are just really excellent science journalism pieces. All of them are award winners. They're all featured in independent media. This first one, Off Balance, is about a condition called ataxia. You can see from the pull quote sort of the gist of the piece. But the reporter really sort of embedded himself deeply with patients and families and the devastating consequences of this. And he also similarly tracked the scientists who are trying to find the causes and the treatments for this condition. Another site with several stories about climate change is the People's Archive of Rural India. This site is very valuable. Indian media has a huge diversity problem. Most of the reporting is about urban issues, and most of the reporting is about urban issues. The media executives are mostly men. They're also mostly upper caste men. So a site like PARI is, sort of documenting the struggles and issues of people in rural India where 65% of the population still lives. This entire section of climate change is excellent. It's talking about the consequences of drought and flooding and severe heat. And as you can see from that little drop down, the stories are also available in different languages, which makes it really accessible for people. And the final piece I chose is this beautifully written piece, Succession, another award winner. You can also see from the pull quote what sort of the theme of this one is. But Athira, she's a former wildlife biologist, and she actually was part of that first cohort of the Science Journalism Workshop, and is now a full-time science journalist. And she really beautifully documents, the discovery of a new frog species in the Western Ghats. And that's a biodiversity hotspot along the southern coast of India, southwest. And she, goes along with the scientist into the field, and she finds out how exactly the species is determined to be indeed a new species and not something that's already been seen. So that's it for that. And thank you so much. I look forward to the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Now, back to the world's second largest democracy, Pam Bellick.
I've been called a lot of things, but never the world's second largest democracy. It's really humbling to be here speaking to this room of just terrific journalists. Thanks to the amazing Deborah Blum for inviting me. Thanks to Ashley, Claire, Miles, the whole team here for putting this all together, all the people who are serving us and helping make this run. It's a lot of work. I am with the great class of 2008. I think there are 7 of us here. Oh, there they are. There they are. You all can hear me okay? We were Boyce Rensberger's last class, which either means he left on a high note or after us he just could not handle it anymore. I don't know which one. It's an honor to share the stage with Boyce and my fellow panelists, and especially Akin, who I think has ceded his remaining minute or two to me, so I might go a little bit over. And to follow the phenomenal Mary Roach, I also have written a cat story, but it did not win any Cat Magazine awards. It did involve tangentially a cat communicator, so if you're interested, you can ask me about that later. All right. See if I can get this thing to work. So I was asked to give a sense of how science and medical coverage at the New York Times has been evolving. And there's a lot to talk about. I could fill, my 10 minutes just extolling the work of my talented colleagues on everything from astronomy to archaeology. But it seemed to make sense with this amount of time to focus on one subject area. And so since my days, nights, weekends, overnights in recent, over the last year have been filled with coverage of the abortion situation, I figured I'd use the example of reproductive health, which is an area that I've covered for probably about a dozen years. And one evolution I've noticed has simply been the increased attention that the Times is giving to reproductive health and the gradual diminishment of squeamishness that editors have about it. We used to have to use euphemisms like private parts. This is not exactly Masters and Johnson territory, but close. And editors seem to be especially uncomfortable when a story involved the female anatomy. To be fair, this was less true of the science editors. So, for example, a story in 2011 about efforts to develop a male contraceptive pill, in a draft that was edited by our science editors, I quoted a researcher saying that a drug that blocks sperm production was being tested on rabbits that were, quote, trained to ejaculate into a fake vagina, unquote. But when the story was chosen to run on the Sunday front page, the Sunday editors objected to that quote. Apparently there's some Sunday brunch test that has to pass. People were worried that the readers would spit out their mimosas. I'm not sure, but anyway, what was published said only that the drug was tested on rabbits. Very disappointing to me. This fellow, Steve Owens, he was a participant in one of the contraceptive trials, and I like to show this photo because I really have no idea why we included his iguana. In the photo, there was nothing about iguana vaginas in the story. By contrast, in a later story about preventing HIV infections in Africa by circumcising men, which ran in the science section, I got to use this quote: "We're hacking away at it every month. Those foreskins are flying." And we got no complaining letters. Someone did suggest that Flying Foreskins would make a good name for a band. I keep trying to convince my jazz group to adopt it. So far, no luck. And more recently, when I was writing about custom-fit condoms, 60 sizes, mostly created because standard condoms are generally too long for many men, this is true, the editors let me start my story with this line: "Condoms get a bad rap for being a bad rap." This was a, sorry. This was a story I reported in part. I was trying many ways to find men who fit the target demographic, and finally I reached out to a Reddit group for men who consider themselves undersized. And they kind of welcomed me. One of them was very wary and was like, "Who are you, bro? I doubt your legitimacy." But I talked him into it, and I got some good stuff. Well, so there's also been, in a more serious vein, a growing openness to exploring some very sensitive and serious issues that intersect with reproductive health and women's health. I spent time over 2 years off and on talking with women who had undergone female genital cutting as girls in Africa and had since moved to the United States and were seeking experimental surgery to try to restore or reconstruct the genital areas that were damaged. This is Safiatou Sila. She immigrated from Sierra Leone. She was one of the women who experienced consequences from having been cut, including physical pain, especially in childbirth and during sex, health complications, difficulty achieving sexual pleasure, and just feeling incomplete or stigmatized when trying to engage in romantic relationships in the United States. And I was given, a lot of time and allowed to be very patient in doing this story because my editors realized how rare it is for women in these circumstances to share their experiences. And so ultimately I was able to visit Marian Gabaya, she's on the top left, in Columbus, Ohio, and Aminata Welcome in Philadelphia. And Aminata even allowed me to be in the operating room during her surgery. That's me with the notebook. Readers told us they were grateful for the women's bravery and also for the frank way that the story described their experiences, including their sexual and emotional trauma. And this was a very unusual kind of story for the Times, and actually the managing editor of the Times, who's now our executive editor, told me he thought that the story was a watershed not only because of the way it dealt with the subject, but also for the very candid and non-euphemistic way it was written, and that was a conscious decision that my editor, Celia Duggar, and I made because we thought it was important to provide an honest look at this situation. And so bringing us forward into sort of the abortion era that we're in now, we've tried to bring that kind of candor and sensitivity to our coverage of abortion. This is a story actually I did several years ago about telemedicine abortion, and I spent a lot of time talking with, I think, 7 patients altogether. Ashley Dale, who's pictured there, allowed me to join her Zoom medical consultation. And our photographer was with her when she took the pills at home in Hawaii. And since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, I've worked to document some of those implications, which I believe are affecting not just reproductive health, but health in general, and widening the chasm of racial and economic inequities. These days, at the Times, there's a lot of interaction and collaboration between departments, not just on abortion, on many subjects. So personally, I have fact-checked descriptions of medical conditions in modern love columns, obituaries, wedding columns, stories from the sports desk to the food section. And I'm always happy when they reach out to me, even though it's time-consuming, because I'm glad that they're interested in trying to get it right. I've helped colleagues spot misinformation. For example, some other media have used anti-abortion terms like chemical abortion as though they are mainstream terms. And even some of colleagues have mentioned those terms in planning discussions about coverage. So they're apparently unaware that it's a signifier of a particular ideological view. So it's helpful to have somebody who knows the lay of the land. And so there's a lot of interaction there. Collaborating with other departments also allows us to combine our strengths and our skills. And so this was a project that our graphics and multimedia department did that they asked me to consult on, and they basically analyzed the safety results from 101 studies on medication abortion, essentially doing their own meta-analysis with the help of several physicians. This was a piece I did with Julie Creswell, who's a business writer, looking at the Walgreens abortion pill situation and trying to clarify some misconceptions that were flying around about that. So bringing us to the Texas abortion pill lawsuit, that is a real signature effort it reflects our efforts to really try to fire on all cylinders and cooperate and collaborate. And so everything from on-the-ground reporting to using different formats and platforms. So I've written about it, worked on podcasts, episodes with The Daily. I gave feedback to this project by Allison McCann and Amy Schoenfeld-Walker of the graphics department that shows the landscape of medication abortion in the country. My colleague, Katie Benner, who was covering the Justice Department, got tipped that a hearing would be scheduled in Amarillo, and the judge had delayed announcing it, so we wrote about that together. And then I immediately booked flights to Amarillo for the hearing, and the day before that, while I was still in Amarillo, I did another podcast. And then, in the realm of shoe leather reporting, I got up at 4:30 a.m. and stood outside the courthouse for hours to get one of the limited press seats. And Allison McCann of graphics flew to Dallas to be in the only overflow room where the hearings were live streamed. And then after the ruling came down, Charlie Savage, who covers legal policy in the Washington Bureau, collaborated with me to annotate the ruling. And so one of my favorite things about this kind of interdisciplinary approach is that it allows for different types of storytelling and for reaching a wider and more diverse audience. And I'll just give you one example here. This was a podcast episode that The Daily fashioned after I wrote a piece about how abortion restrictions are also affecting patients experiencing miscarriage. And the producers of that episode incorporated audio from my interviews with a woman in Texas whose name is Amanda. She'd had 2 miscarriages, one a few months before a restrictive law took effect there, and one a few months after, and she went to the same hospital both times, but had very different experiences. And there's a little bit of audio there if the folks at AV could play it.
So different from my first experience where they were so nice and so comforting to just feel like alone and terrified.
So what happens to her once she gets home?
She goes home, you know, she's in an adult diaper. She goes and sits on the toilet because she's bleeding.
And there's like fingernail marks in my wall because it felt like I was going through labor on my toilet.
She's just in so much pain. Her husband fills up the bathtub with warm water. They think that might be a little bit more comforting for her.
And we were scared and we were sad and I was in pain and he didn't know what to do. And it was scaring him because the bathtub, you know, the water is just dark red. Like you're just sitting in a tub. It looks like it's filled with blood.
So you can, you know, hear the power of that, like hearing her actual voice, and that's something that I can't do in writing the story, so I just really welcome those collaborations. We also work with video producers, and there's terrific video innovation happening at the Times. And I will close with a snippet of a condom video, just to circle back. This is a 3.5-minute video, but I'm going to ask them only to play the first 28 seconds. I worked on this a while ago, so it's not new, but I think it's kind of fun. If you guys can hit it. Oops. Yeah.
We have ice cream. We have lychee, mango, and even durian flavored that comes from China.
Bidia de Perth works for the United Nations Family Planning Agency, and her goal is to decrease unplanned pregnancies and sexually transmitted diseases like HIV. These are big problems in the developing world, and there are 2.5 million new HIV infections every year.
You are not going to believe it, but this is also a condom.
Ms. de Perth has been trying to offer different...
Okay, you guys can... I'm just trying to stick to time, so we did not get to the slingshot condom or the spray-on condom, but if any of you are interested, I'm happy to play the rest later. I'll close there, and thanks so much. Turn it over to Boyce.
Thank you, Pam. We're going to open it up for questions now, but I want to take the moderator's privilege of just making one comment on coverage of sex and wording in the paper. In the 70s, at the Times, I covered Masters and Johnson, and I wrote a story in which the word clitoris made it onto the front page.
No kidding.
Look it up.
Wow.
So, okay, are the microphone wranglers there? Okay, good. And
Sure, great panel. Very much enjoyed it. I want to ask a question of Pam on your April 2023 story on that brilliant decision out of Texas. So I actually teach your story in a class at MIT on science, technology, and public policy. And it's noteworthy because you did present the evidence on efficacy and safety, the results of the meta-study, the 101, and you also mentioned FDA REMS, which runs flat up against the stipulations and assumptions of the judge. Did you get pushback from anyone on being unfair, biased, inappropriate in gathering that information and incorporating it into what I thought was an excellent news story?
Thank you. No, I don't think we did get any pushback. Readers have been just very, very interested in, that case and abortion in general. And they're very communicative. But no, I think they have appreciated the way that we've tried to sort of reflect a lot of different aspects of it, and not do kind of both sides of them at all, but also to reflect that there are different views and that it's a complicated issue.
And how unusual is it to do a meta-analysis, the 101 studies? Because again, it's not something you see all the time.
Now that I think that is unusual. Yeah.
Right. I thought it was great.
We don't do
Thank
our own
you.
studies all the time, but yeah. But we talked about that because that was our way of. So in that abortion case, the plaintiffs are these anti-abortion medical organizations, and they have submitted their claim. They try to support their claim that mifepristone is unsafe by submitting 5 studies, 2 or 3 of which are conducted by an anti-abortion organization, I believe. And so we were meeting, and this was a project that was driven by our graphics people, Allison McCann and Amy Schuldenheld-Walker, and others. But we were having a meeting, and they said, what if we tried to sort of look at the evidence that they are providing and see if there's any there, and look at the other evidence that the FDA is citing, which is many more studies and much more rigorous, so we thought, well, nobody's really done that, nobody's done that who doesn't have kind of skin in the game one way or the other. It's hard to find people in the people have very strong opinions. So you have people doing very good research, but they are also abortion rights supporters. So we thought being able to do it ourselves would be.
Another question?
Yeah.
Hi, Tiago, this one's for you. I was really interested in your work on the Amazon, and I think it's now getting sort of renewed attention now that Bolsonaro's out of office, and there's a lot of reports on, okay, what actually happened under Bolsonaro with Amazon destruction and with indigenous groups. And I guess I'm just wondering, do you feel like, what's the quality of science journalism within all of the news that's coming out, I guess both in Brazil and then your perspective on media outside of Brazil covering all of that?
Thank you very much for your question. I think there's been a lot of great pieces produced both in Brazil and abroad. And I'm not sure I understand what you mean by the connection between good stories and Bolsonaro leaving, but do you want to?
I can try and clarify. I was thinking, I know during COVID, suddenly there was all this interest. So reporters who were not science reporters really maybe even have any trust in learning more about the science we're covering it, and it made it sort of messy and difficult. And I'm just wondering if you feel like your beautiful, deep research and kind of scientific approach is being taken up everywhere, or do you feel like it's a bit weak without enough science?
That's a great question. My personal view of this is that I think that science and environmental journalism are key to our future, and the more, the better, in my opinion. But we do need to, equip journalists better. In Brazil, for instance, we need to help journalists develop the capacity to incorporate, like journalists who are not from science journalism, to incorporate practices that we have and knowledge that we have in order to do a better job. So one thing that I believe we need to do more often is to communicate amongst ourselves more often in order to improve the level of and the capacity of covering stories that are dense properly. So that too happens in the Amazon often. When you see, for instance, that Bolsonaro created a terrible situation, deforestation increased and went back to levels that we saw 15 years ago. and now Lula's government is beginning, and you do see stories saying that deforestation is still in very high levels, so nothing is changing, but there's a context there that needs to be explained to people, that it takes a while to stop deforestation, and every government in Brazil faced the same challenge. Like when you receive like this bad heritage from a previous government, it's going to take a while to decrease deforestation, for instance. So that's one kind of an example of a tricky thing that environmental and science journalists have, and we need to spread the word. By the way, Giovanna Girardi is here. She's also a fellow and one of the most important environmental journalists in Brazil. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm Steve Dickman from the class of '93. Right after my fellowship, I was writing a story for a German magazine about the likely impact of the internet on journalism. And I found out that if you called up the New York Times and asked for an interview with the publisher, at that time Arthur Sulzberger Jr., he answered his own phone after 5 p.m. So I interviewed him for my story, and I asked him about the likely impact of the internet on journalism, and he said, well, I mean, unfiltered information is going to come out in large amounts, but we think it'll be good for us because people are going to look to established news brands to give them information that they can trust. So there's no doubt in my mind that it has been good for the New York Times. Just look at the subscriber numbers. But my question for Akin, you addressed this issue, and Mary Rose, of course, and Pam, is there any reason for optimism? Can you give us evidence for optimism that the battle against disinformation is actually going well for those of us who oppose disinformation?
That's an easy question, right? Yeah.
Well, the key thing is, for every story, there is a byline. What will people say about your byline? We used to have, at a stage in Nigeria, for example, during the crisis of the military dictatorship, and there were a lot of misinformation. You listen to certain programs at night. And when you listen to NTA, the National Television Authority platform, and you wait till 10, 11 p.m. to listen to the real story from Channels Television. And within NTA also, we knew those who would do the right thing. Someone like Dironi Fadi, who was a Knight Fellow in 2002. And as a science journalist, your byline matters a lot in terms of, even when you see this information, what do you do about it? When COVID came, I did 2 articles with another colleague on misinformation, disinformation, and so on and so forth. So it becomes personal. You know, whom are you influencing? Are you influencing them within your newsroom? When HIV/AIDS cure came, I happened to go and interview the guy, an immunologist, who was a medical doctor, and he was, very brilliant and stuff like that. After the interview, I was leaving. Someone came and said, look, this is for you. The envelope was brown. I know, I'm sure that Boyce knows something about that. And I told him that, look, if I take this envelope, I'm going to finish you. Sorry, I don't want it. Then I left from there, went to another place about 200 kilometers from, this was something like 400 kilometers from my office. I was not sent because there was no authorization to go. But I went to that community, I found a couple in their 70s with a 13-year-old who was living with them, their granddaughter. Their daughter had died. Then I went to another family. I found Agnes. That was the name I gave to her then. And I saw Agnes. Agnes was on her deathbed. And I went back to the office and did a story that HIV was in the bedroom of virtually everyone, because Agnes had worked in Lagos, as a commercial sex worker. Then when he was sick, he went back to the Middle Belt to go and by a week after, she died. Another time I went to Mozambique, I found another Agnes. So for me, the byline matters. Yes, we can't, rule out misinformation and so on and so forth, but we need to stand to our trade in a way that at any point in time, we are influenced. Because the bottom line of everything is the populace, the taxpayers. Those are the people that we are influencing one way or the other. Because if you don't do it, if your neighbor is eating bad frog or something, when the problem comes, your neighbor will not sleep and you will not sleep also. Thank you.
Is there a microphone over here? Yeah.
Yes, hi. Richard Hudson, class of '92. Yay, an old fart. As someone who's worked outside the U.S. most of my career, one thing that concerns me and people I speak to is the rising geopolitical walls. China, Russia, U.S., the rest of the world. And the impact that's going to have and maybe having on science already, collaboration in science. So I guess my question is, our colleagues from Nature may have seen it first, but are you already seeing in the journalism and in the paper submissions any impact of this new geopolitical situation? And is there anything that we as journalists could or should do about it?
Masood, you want to take that?
Thanks for the question, Richard. I mean, we're definitely seeing it. We're seeing it, and we've done some reporting on the drop-off, for example, in collaborations between China and the US. I mean, that was pretty much on an unmitigated upward trajectory for the last 20 years. And I think a little bit post-pandemic, it's either flatlining or beginning to drop now. And there are other factors, there are other reasons why. One of those is that China used to have an incentive system where people were recognized and rewarded for international collaborations as part of their attempts to sort of build their research infrastructure. And that ended in, I think, 2021. They're also very keen to build their own publishing system. They want, ultimately, in perhaps 20 years' time, to have something like the kind of ecosystem that comes out of the Western nations, so that's also part of it. So I think that's definitely happening. And then, of course, we're all affected by sanctions in different ways. And, we, in terms of our, policies around publishing, we don't say that you can't publish depending, where you're from. But, of course, we have to comply with laws. And right now, the sanctions regime, for example, against Russia is pretty onerous. And so when those kinds of papers do come in, then they do go through additional scrutiny and additional filters than they perhaps would have done before. So yes, it is having an impact.
Hi, my concern about science journalism going forward is not the quality of journalism that's out there, which is very high, but access to it and how expensive some of the best outlets are. I recently went from home delivery to digital of the New York Times because I couldn't afford it, and I'm a journalist, and I'm motivated to pay for that. And so I'm thinking so many people just get their news where it's free, and Fox News is probably very easy to get, and the New York Times is much more narrow and other places. So I'm just wondering, is there a model out there, nonprofit model? Is there, is this going to become worse and worse of a problem where the quality of science journalism is out there, but so many people just can't access it for financial reasons?
That's sort of the gate and fences issue. We're at the gates. How do we? And the gates cost money to go through sometimes. Anybody want to take that question, Pam?
I think it's a good question for you.
You think it was, who was that, to whom were you addressing?
I would throw it to boys.
Anyone that has a thought about
Anyone?
Yeah, let me just say that Nature Africa is free, so you can start from there.
I can try and definitely not giving a definitive answer, but it's something that I've been thinking a lot and trying to deal within the scope of my work. Just first, I want to quickly address what you questioned before. I just want to say that it's important to create the proper conditions for training journalists that want to cover science and the environment in other places, in other countries. And I think that foundations like the Knight Foundations and others are key for that, you know. So I think, in my opinion, I think the community of science journalists is a little bit behind when it comes to be updated with the most innovative ideas that are out there for producing and distributing science journalism. The journalistic operation is good journalism is expensive, right? Especially good science journalism. So one of the perspectives that I think that are more promising is trying to incorporate new methods, new process that technology startups use, for instance. So, for instance, product journalism product thinking in journalism is an interesting segment to follow, because we tend to think wrongly. I mean, I did have my I didn't accept the word product very easily as well. And then I started to understand that product thinking actually speaks to a way to understand the audience needs and what the audience wants and their habits of consumption, of news consumption, for instance. So we need to go out there and try and understand what they want, how they want. It doesn't mean that they are going to drive our work. No one wakes up and say, "Oh, I need a very good investigative journalistic piece," you know. No one is going to tell you that, and that's important. So, but you do have to listen to them and understand what is missing. And then I think that's the first step before thinking about how to finding ways to improve the access. Because if you improve the access without thinking of how to finance your production, then your dream is going to die very, very quickly.
So unfortunately, that's going to have to be our last question of this morning session, but hopefully we can continue this conversation over lunch. Let's give another round of applause to our panelists. And to our moderator, Boyce Rensberger.